The 1st Marine Division, which was to make the landings, had been moving overseas while the Joint Chiefs of Staff were discussing the attack against the Solomons. Brought to war strength at New River, NC, between 7 December 1941 and 1 May 1942, it had then been organized around 2 infantry regiments, the 1st Marines and 5th Marines, and 1 artillery regiment, the 11th Marines. The 7th Marines, the 3rd Infantry Regiment, had been detached for service with the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade in Samoa. The division had engaged in field exercises and combat firing at New River, and during March and April, each battalion landing team of the 5th Marines and one of the 1st Marines engaged in 10-day landing exercises at Solomon's Island, Maryland. The division was commanded by a 55-year-old veteran of Caribbean and Chinese expeditions, Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift. After attending the University of Virginia for 2 years, Vandergrift had been commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in the Marine Corps in 1909. He served in Nicaragua, Mexico, and Haiti, and in 1916 began 2 years' service with the Haitian Constabulary. After a brief tour of duty in the United States, he served again in Haiti from 1919 to 1923. Upon completing the field officer's course at Quantico, Virginia, in 1926, he became Assistant Chief of Staff at the Marine Base at San Diego, California. Vandergrift then served for over a year as Operations and Training Officer on the staff of the 3rd Marine Brigade in China. Returning to the United States in 1928, he held various staff positions, including one with the newly founded Fleet Marine Force, until 1935. He served in Peiping, China, for 2 years, and from 1937 to 1941 was at Marine Corps Headquarters in Washington. Ordered to the 1st Marine Division in 1941 as a brigadier general, he was promoted to Major General and took command of the division in March 1942 with Brigadier General William H. Rupertus as his assistant division commander. Vandergrift had not believed that his division was sufficiently well trained for combat when he was notified in April that it was to be sent to New Zealand as part of the South Pacific Amphibious Force to establish bases and train for portable, minor landing offensives and counterattacks to be designated at a later date. He had not expected that any combat missions would be assigned before January 1943. Division headquarters and the 5th Marines reached Wellington, the capital city of New Zealand, on 14 June, but the 2nd Echelon did not arrive until 11 July. The 2nd Echelon was still at sea when Admiral Gormley called Vandergrift to Auckland on 26 June to announce the plan to use the 1st Marine Division less 7th Marines, reinforced by the 2nd Marines, the 1st Raider Battalion, and the 3rd Defence Battalion, in the Solomons about 1 August 1942. The division's plans had to be prepared semi-independently, for Admirals Fletcher and Turner had not yet arrived in the South Pacific. According to Vandergrift, there was no time for a deliberate planning phase, and in many instances irrevocable decisions had to be made even before the essential features of the naval plan of operations could be ascertained. There was an absence of meeting of minds of commanders concerned. General Vandergrift's plans were based upon the assumption that the Allies would firmly control the air and sea routes to the Solomons. In a little over 1 month, the division, hiding its preparations under the guise of preliminaries for amphibious training, had to prepare tactical and logistical plans, unload part of its ships, reload for combat, sail from Wellington to the Fijis, rehearse, and sail to the Solomons, in addition to gathering data on the islands and on Japanese strength and dispositions there. The 1st Marine Division's intelligence section, on receiving Gormley's orders, immediately began to gather data on terrain, landing beaches, climate, and the natives from United States Army and Navy monographs, extracts from the Pacific Islands Yearbook, and reports of the British Navy and Colonial Office. There was no opportunity for ground patrols to reconnoitre the islands prior to the invasion. Colonel Frank B. Goetsch, the intelligence officer of the 1st Marine Division, and his section interviewed former Solomons' residents, civil servants, and merchant ships officers in New Zealand. On 1 July, Colonel Goetsch flew to General MacArthur's headquarters to collect information. Spending 1 week in Melbourne and several days in Sydney, he interviewed former residents of the Solomons in those cities. 8 of these men were given commissions or warrants by the Australian forces and were attached to the 1st Marine Division as guides, advisors, and pilots. They reported to division headquarters on 15 July to interpret maps and aerial photographs. The Solomons, with their green mountains, forested shores, low-hanging clouds, and coral reefs, are beautiful when viewed from the air or from the calm inter-island channels, but they present difficult terrain for military operations. They are covered by heavy tropical rainforests. Mountains, deep rivers, swamps, heat, humidity, heavy rains, and mud, combined with the jungle, make all movements extremely difficult. Except along the sandy beaches, vehicles cannot move until roads have been built. At the opening of the campaign, there were few vehicular roads. Tulagi had some trails, and a trail had been built through the coconut groves on the north coast of Guadalcanal, but the only inland passages were native footpaths. There were no bridges suitable for artillery and heavy equipment. The islands are unhealthful. Malaria as well as dengue fever is common. The malarial Anopheles mosquito breeds in swamps, lagoons, sluggish streams and puddles, and has seeded the natives heavily. In addition, fungus infections and sores were to plague all the troops. Only the utmost efforts at the prevention of disease would keep troops healthy, but living and combat conditions on Guadalcanal were to make systematic malaria control difficult. Guadalcanal, which is shaped like a paramecium, is 90 miles long and averages over 25 miles in width. A backbone of forested mountains and quiescent volcanoes, rising in some places as high as 7,000 feet, runs the length of the island. Coral reefs and sharply rising mountains make the south coast inhospitable for ships. The north coast has no harbours, but Sea Lark Channel is calm. Many sandy beaches on the north coast are free of reefs and provide suitable landing areas for amphibious operations. From Aola Bay to the Matanikau River, between the mountains and Sea Lark Channel, there is a flat, narrow, grassy plain. Coconut plantations line most of the beach, and there are some stretches of high, tough kunai grass. The plain is cut by many rivers and streams. They are generally deep and swift, and are frequently flooded by rains. Stagnant pools have formed at most of the river mouths through the accumulation of silt, which, massing cones and sandbars, blocks the flow of water. The coastal plain ends east of the Matanikau River. Between the river and Cape Esperance at the northwest tip of the island, a narrow corridor lies between the coastline and the high ground on the south. Steep ravines and abruptly rising ridges cut laterally across the corridor. Lunga Point, where the Japanese were building their airstrip in July and August of 1942, is dominated by Mount Austin, a 1,514-foot-high series of ridges and knolls about 6 miles southwest of the point. Colonel Goach returned from General MacArthur's headquarters with its intelligence estimate of enemy strength and dispositions in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Bismarck Archipelago. This estimate, supplemented by aerial reconnaissance and reports from coast watchers, was the basis of the division's estimate of enemy strength and dispositions in the Solomons. On 20 July, division headquarters believed that 8,400 Japanese were on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, a figure which, like Admiral Turner's, much exceeded Admiral Gormley's. However, by 30 July, Admiral Turner had reduced the Marines' estimate to 7,125. The 1st Marine Division continued to receive radio reports from the coast watchers, which were monitored and transmitted by the American radio at Ep.2, even after the division's departure from Wellington. During the week preceding D-Day, the Solomons coast-watching net broadcast reports 3 times daily in a special code. The reports were to have been relayed directly from Ep.2 to Admiral Turner's flagship at sea, but as the code had not been properly intercepted, they had to be relayed through Australia and New Zealand, a process which sometimes delayed them for 3 days. On 17 July, 2 officers of the Marine Division were taken by a B-17 on a reconnaissance flight from Port Moresby over Guadalcanal and Tulagi. They saw no evidence of any airfields, except for burned-off areas at Lunga Point and Teteray, nor any extensive beach defences on the north coast of Guadalcanal. Returning to Wellington by way of Townsville, Australia, they brought back aerial photographs of Tulagi and a strip map of the Guadalcanal coast between Coley Point and the Matanikau River. There were no good maps of Guadalcanal, a deficiency that was, in fact, never remedied throughout the campaign. During the planning phase, the division's intelligence section never received what it considered an adequate number of aerial photographs of Guadalcanal, although it received a large number of the Tulagi area. The intelligence section used 2 United States Navy hydrographic charts as the bases for its maps. Chart number 2658 of Tulagi and Gavutu on a scale of 1 to 12,000 was fair, showing approximate elevations. Chart number 2916 of Guadalcanal and Florida was enlarged to a scale of 1 to 108,643, but was inaccurate and lacked recent corrections. A crude sketch which had been prepared by colonial officials before the war aided in locating some trails and buildings but lacked contour lines and elevations. The division's base map for the Guadalcanal landing was a 9-sheet strip drawn and reproduced by the photolithographic section from aerial photographs which Colonel Goethe had brought from Australia. The map, based on photographs taken in late June, covered a narrow coastal strip on Guadalcanal from Lunga Point east to Aola, a rough, uncontrolled sketch showing rivers, plains, plantations and forests. It was reproduced before the amphibious forces sortie from Wellington. No more photographs reached the division until 2 August, when Admiral McCain forwarded photographs which had been taken by a B-17 and had been developed aboard the Enterprise. These pictures of Tulagi and Lunga Point showed that the airstrip was nearly complete. The problems of logistics proved as serious as had those of procuring information about enemy strength and dispositions. Preparations began before the intelligence section had completed its work and before the final tactical plans were prepared. The logistical plans were based upon General Vandergrift's organization of the division for combat. On 29 June, he organized the division into 2 regimental combat groups, each of about 4,500 men. Each group was organized into a headquarters and support group, and 3 battalion combat teams. Every combat group consisted of 1 infantry regiment, 1 artillery battalion, 1 company each from the tank, engineer, pioneer, amphibian tractor, and medical battalions, and scout, special weapons, and transport platoons. Each combat team was originally composed of 1 infantry battalion, 1 field artillery battery, and platoons of engineer, pioneer, and amphibian tractor personnel. Scouts, signal, medical, and other service personnel were added to the combat teams prior to the invasion. Combat Group A, commanded by Colonel Leroy P. Hunt, was composed of the 5th Marines and supporting troops. Combat Teams numbers 1, 2, and 3 of Combat Group A consisted of the reinforced 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions, respectively, of the 5th Marines. Combat Group B, Colonel Clifton B. Cates commanding, was made up of the 1st Marines and supporting troops. Combat Teams numbers 4, 5, and 6 of Combat Group B consisted of the reinforced 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions, respectively, of the 1st Marines. On 9 July, the Division Support Group was organized. It consisted of about 3,500 men under Colonel Pedro A. Del Valle, organized into 4 subgroups made up of headquarters, communications, medical, artillery, special weapons, pioneer, engineer, and amphibian tractor personnel, and the 1st Parachute Battalion. The parachutists, fighting as infantry, were later assigned to the attack on Gavutu. The rear echelon, 1,729 men from all divisional units, including the 4th Battalion, 11th Marines with 155mm howitzers, was to remain in Wellington when the division departed. As each combat group was to be embarked in a transport division consisting of 3 transports and 1 cargo ship, every transport in each division was assigned to carry 1 combat team, 3 units of fire, 30 days rations, and quartermaster, ordnance, engineer, chemical, signal, and medical supplies. Supporting troops, heavy equipment, 7 units of fire, 30 days rations and other supplies, and clothing stocks were assigned to each cargo ship. The logistical difficulties did not stem from shortages of materiel, for the division had come overseas with nearly all its equipment and supplies. The shortages were in dock space, time, and shipping. In late June, there were just 7 ships of the amphibious force in Wellington Harbour, 5 transports and 2 cargo ships. More vessels had been assigned, but it was apparent that there would not be enough cargo space to combat load all the division with its supplies and equipment. To embark the maximum number of troops, General Vandergrift ordered that all units reduce their equipment and supplies to those items that are actually required to live and fight. The division was ordered to embark bulk supplies, including rations and fuel, for 60 days instead of the 90 days then considered necessary. The ammunition allowance was reduced by 1/2. Office equipment, cut to a minimum, included no more than 2 typewriters per battalion headquarters and 4 per regimental headquarters. Mess equipment was limited to water bags, vacuum food carriers, camp kettles, coffee mills, and stoves. The order directed that all the division's motor transport would be embarked, all sandbags, rubber boats, outboard motors, camouflage and chemical warfare equipment, all engineering materiel, water purification equipment, 60 days clothing, replenishment of shoes, socks, and green utility suits, and 30 days post-exchange supplies of tobacco, matches, soap, and razor blades only were to be embarked. Officers and enlisted men were ordered to take with them all their individual equipment but to reduce their baggage to a minimum. Each officer was allowed 1 bedding roll, clothing roll, or handbag, while enlisted men were limited to what they could carry in their packs. Loading the division's weapons and supplies on board the ships was a difficult matter. Aotearoa in Wellington was small and could berth only 5 ships at the same time. Combat Group A had already landed, unloaded, and been established inland in base camps prior to 29 June. To clear the quay for the second echelon, it was decided to begin the embarkation of Combat Group A and its equipment and supplies on 2 July. The division supply officer organized the embarkation and combat loading, exercising control through transport quartermasters on the ships and through field officers in charge of the 300-man working parties assigned to each ship. Organized into 3 reliefs, the working parties labored around the clock in 8-hour shifts. Except for a few skilled civilian operators of loading machines, cranes, hoists, carriers, and stacking machines, Marines performed all dockside labor. All divisional motor transport plus 18 10-wheeled trucks of the 1st Base Depot and 30 flatbedded New Zealand Army lorries moved supplies, equipment, and ammunition from their depots to the dockside. By 13 July, Combat Group A and its gear had been embarked. A few shortages were made up by local purchases in Wellington, and others were alleviated by materiel carried by the second echelon. After embarkation, Combat Group A practiced landings in Wellington Harbour. The second echelon, largely troops of Combat Group B and the support group, encountered much greater difficulty. It arrived at Aotearoa on 11 July, while Combat Group A was completing its embarkation. As it had not been anticipated that the division would be tactically employed after its arrival in New Zealand, the ships had not been combat loaded before leaving the United States. Most of the troops had been carried across the Pacific aboard passenger vessels, while cargo ships carried their supplies and equipment. The second echelon was forced to unload, sort, and classify stores and equipment on the limited dock space, and to reload for combat by 22 July. The weather had been clear while the first group had embarked, but, during the entire period of the second echelon's unloading and re-embarkation, cold, driving rains typical of a New Zealand winter made the task miserable. The morale of the troops, working in the rain, was low. Many of the supplies had been packed in cardboard cartons, which, becoming soggy from the rains, burst and strewed their contents over the docks. Other cardboard cartons, stacked inside the warehouse, were crushed. Lack of cargo space prevented the division from loading all its motor transport aboard the 12 available ships. Nearly all the quarter-ton and 1-ton trucks were put aboard, but 75% of the heavier vehicles were left behind in Wellington with the rear echelon. The engineers expected that the Lunga Point airfield would perhaps be almost complete by D-Day, but put earth-moving equipment, in addition to bridging equipment and a portable dock, aboard the cargo ship Fomalhaut. Medical preparations for the campaign had not been difficult. Those medically unfit for foreign service had been left behind in the United States. The standard of health remained fairly high, except for troops on board 1 transport of the second echelon. Among those Marines, rotten food on the voyage to New Zealand had caused a loss of weight varying from 16 to 20 pounds per man, as well as a diarrhea epidemic. Exposure, while loading in Wellington, had resulted in some cases of colds and influenza, and a few sporadic cases of mumps broke out en route to the target area. The medical plans provided for medical care, under combat conditions, of 18,134 men for 90 days. By 22 July, reloading had been completed, and the division was ready to sail from Wellington. On 20 July, when logistical preparations had been almost completed in Wellington, General Vandergrift issued tactical orders for the landings. The grouping of forces for Tulagi and Guadalcanal was based upon the premise that of the 8,400 Japanese, which the intelligence section believed to be defending the objectives, 1,400 troops, including 1 infantry and 1 anti-aircraft battalion, were in the Tulagi area. 1 reinforced infantry regiment, 1 anti-aircraft battalion, 1 engineer battalion, pioneers, and others 7,000 in all were thought to be on Guadalcanal. The major part of these were expected to be at Lunga Point, with a smaller force at Coley Point. These estimates greatly exaggerated enemy strength. In early August, there were about 780 Japanese in the Tulagi-Gavutu-Tanambogo area and 2,230 on Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley's original estimate of 3,100 had been correct, as it was anticipated that the invasion of the Tulagi area, involving direct attacks against small islands, would be the most difficult. The most experienced battalions were assigned to this attack. To protect the flanks of the units landing on Tulagi and other islets, small forces were to land first on nearby Florida. 1 battalion would then land on Tulagi, followed quickly by a second. A 3rd battalion would land on Gavutu at H+4 hours to seize Gavutu and Tanambogo. The Guadalcanal landing presented a simpler tactical problem than did the landing on Tulagi. The large number of undefended beaches on the north coast would make it possible for the remainder of the division to land unopposed at some distance from the Japanese. The area selected for the landing lies between the Tenaru and Tenavatu rivers, about 6,000 yards east of the Lunga airstrip, well away from both Lunga and Coley points. Having landed and established a beachhead, the Guadalcanal group of the division under General Vandergrift could then attack west to capture the airfield. This maneuver would require the troops to cross both the Tenaru and the Ilu rivers, but the Tenaru and the Tenavatu rivers, on either flank of the beach, would help to protect the beachhead if the Japanese counterattacked while men and supplies were coming ashore. The orders issued on 20 July utilized the previous organization of the division into combat groups, combat teams, and the support group. The orders also organized the reinforcing units, the reinforced 2nd Marines, the 1st Raider Battalion, and 3rd Defense Battalion, which had not then joined the division. The 2nd Marines, reinforced, commanded by Colonel John M. Arthur, included the 2nd Marines, the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines with 75mm pack howitzers, and engineer, pioneer, amphibian tractor, tank, medical, and other service troops, a total of 4,840 men. This reinforced regiment was organized like the others into a headquarters and support group, and 3 combat teams of about 1,300 each. Combat teams A, B, and C were composed of the reinforced 1st, 2nd, and 3rd battalions, respectively. The 1st Raider Battalion, totaling 828 men, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson. The 3rd Defense Battalion, Colonel Robert H. Pepper commanding, totaled 872 men. These reinforcements, when they arrived, increased the division's strength to over 19,000. The 20 July orders prescribed 8 groups of varying strengths. Combat Group A, Colonel Hunt commanding, 4,398, to be subsequently reduced by about 1,100 by the assignment of Combat Team No. 2. 1 reinforced infantry battalion to the Tulagi attack. Combat Group B, Colonel Cates commanding, 4,531. The support group, Colonel Del Valle commanding, 3,537. The Tulagi group, the 1st Raider Battalion and Combat Team No. 2 of Combat Group A, Colonel Edson commanding. The Gavutu group, Major Robert Williams commanding, 395 of the 1st Parachute Battalion. The Florida group, Major Robert E. Hill commanding, 1,295 of Combat Team A, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, reinforced, the 3rd Defense Battalion, and the Division Reserve, the 2nd Marines, reinforced, less Combat Team A Colonel Arthur commanding, 3,545. These forces were to attack and destroy the hostile garrisons on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo, and Macambo by landings on D-Day, and then to organize the defense of those islands. There were not enough landing craft, however, to execute all landings simultaneously. At H-20 minutes, 1 rifle company and 1 machine gun platoon of Combat Team A, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, reinforced were to land at Haleta on Florida, just west of Tulagi, to cover the Tulagi landing. At H+30 minutes, the remainder of Combat Team A would seize Halavo, the peninsula on Florida just east of Gavutu, and support the Gavutu attack by fire. The Tulagi group, led by the 1st Raider Battalion, would land on a 500-yard front on Tulagi at H hour and seize the northwest part of the island. Having reached the first phase line about 1,500 yards northwest of the southeast shore, the attack troops would signal for a 5-minute air and naval bombardment upon the defense positions in the hills and ravines around Government House, the cricket field, the hospital, the prison and the radio station, then attack and capture that area. Once taken, the island was to pass to the control of the commander of Combat Team No. 2, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, reinforced, Less E Battery, 11th Marines of Combat Group A. The 1st Raider Battalion would then prepare to re-embark for further operations. Combat Team No. 2 was to embark enough troops to seize Macambo, northeast of Tulagi, and also was to relieve the 1st Parachute Battalion after it had captured Gavutu and Tanambogo. The 3rd Defense Battalion was to land 1/3 of its anti-aircraft strength on Tulagi. The 1st Parachute Battalion was to land on the east coast of Gavutu at H+4 hours, seize it, and then take Tanambogo, the small island connected with Gavutu by a concrete causeway. The firing of a green star cluster would be the signal for 5 minutes of naval gunfire on Tanambogo from the Tulagi Fire Support Group. After the capture of the islets, the battalion was to be prepared to re-embark for employment elsewhere. While operations were being conducted against the northern islets by air squadrons, the Tulagi Fire Support Group, Transport Group Y, and the marine units under General Rupertus's command, the rest of the force air squadrons, the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group, Transport Group X, and the majority of the Marine Division under General Vandergrift would be operating against Guadalcanal. Combat Group A, 5th Marines, reinforced, Less Combat Team. No. 2, 2nd Battalion, reinforced, Less E Battery, 11th Marines, was to land at 0 hour on a 1,600-yard front with combat teams abreast to take the beachhead. Combat Group B, 1st Marines, reinforced, was to land in column of battalions at 0+50 minutes, pass through Group A, and attack westward toward the grassy knoll Mount Austin, which was erroneously believed to be only 4 instead of 6 miles southwest of Lunga Point. This course, it was hoped, would prevent the Japanese from escaping southward into the mountains. The 1st Marines was to maintain contact with the units advancing on its right. The formation would be a column of battalions echeloned to the left and rear to protect the left flank. Group A, after Group B had passed through, was to send Combat Team No. 1, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines west along the shore to seize the Ilu River line. In the order, the Ilu was mistakenly called the Tenaru. Combat Team No. 3, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, was to seize the line of woods running southeast from the Tenavatu River, thus covering the east line of the beachhead. The division's light tanks, landing with the combat groups, were also to cover the east flank of the beachhead but were not to be committed to action except on orders from General Vandergrift. Platoons of a battery of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion were to land on the flanks of the beach to provide anti-aircraft defense with automatic weapons. They were to revert to control of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion of the support group upon the landing of that battalion's headquarters. The artillery battalions of the combat groups were to land with their groups, but to pass to control of the headquarters of the 11th Marines of the support group upon the landing of that headquarters. The support group, including elements of the artillery, engineer, special weapons, and pioneer battalions, was to land on orders from division headquarters and to coordinate the artillery support for the attacks of the combat groups, as well as the anti-aircraft defense of the beachhead. The 3rd Defense Battalion, less 1/3 of its anti-aircraft units, was to land on divisional order, pass to control of the support group, and assist in the defense of the beachhead. Combat Team A of the Division Reserve, 2nd Marines, reinforced, had been released to General Vandergrift for the Florida landing, but the remainder of the reserve was to remain under Admiral Turner's control for the occupation of Ndeni if it was not required for Guadalcanal and Tulagi. General Vandergrift ordered the reserve, however, to be prepared to land Combat Team B less its reinforcing elements at H+4 hours, and to be ready to attach Combat Team C minus its reinforcing units to the Tulagi group. While the division was making ready for combat, the other units which were to make up the invading force were sailing toward their respective rendezvous areas. The carrier Wasp came from the Atlantic Ocean through the Panama Canal. On 1 July, she sailed from San Diego, escorting the 5 ships bearing the 2nd Marines, reinforced, across the Pacific. On 7 July, the carrier Saratoga, with Admiral Fletcher on board, and her supporting warships departed from Pearl Harbor, followed by the carrier Enterprise and her supporting ships. The destroyer transports, which had helped to escort the Enterprise, left the carrier at sea and sailed to New Caledonia to embark the 1st Raider Battalion. The ships from the Southwest Pacific left Brisbane, Australia, on 14 July and arrived at New Zealand 5 days later to come under Admiral Turner's control. On 21 July, Admiral Fletcher, commanding Task Force 61, ordered all units to rendezvous southeast of the Fiji Islands at 1426 July. The 3rd Defence Battalion, on board the Zalin and Beetlejuice, escorted by 2 destroyers, did not leave Pearl Harbor until 22 July and did not join the task force until 3 August. The 12 transports and cargo ships of the amphibious force, carrying the 1st Marine Division together with their escorts, sailed from Wellington on 22 July under Admiral Turner's command. On 26 July, the entire expeditionary force, Task Force 61, except the Zalin and Beetlejuice and their escorts, assembled southeast of the Fijis, and on the next day sailed to Coro for the rehearsal. From 28 through 31 July, the expeditionary force rehearsed with carrier air groups participating. The rehearsal was far from being a success. One of the most serious handicaps was the necessity for maintaining radio silence, which made ground-to-air communication impossible and impeded the coordination of ground force attacks with close air support. 2 complete landing exercises simulating the scheme of maneuver had been planned, but coral reefs made the beaches impracticable for landings. General Vandergrift, who firmly believed in the necessity for complete rehearsals, later wrote that the advantages gained from the Coro rehearsal were dubious when compared with the loss of priceless time. The rehearsal had some value, however, for the force received practice in debarkation procedure and in the conduct and timing of boat waves. The forces supporting the ground troops had an opportunity for firing and bombing practice. Since McCain, Fletcher, Turner, and Vandergrift all attended the rehearsal, they seized this first opportunity for close personal conferences, during which they discussed their plans in detail. Since the performance of landing craft at the rehearsal led the commanders to expect numerous mechanical breakdowns, a boat pool was organized. It was at Coro that the decision was made to land first at Tulagi and later at Guadalcanal on D-Day. The transport Haywood, carrying both the 1st Parachute Battalion and elements of the Guadalcanal Support Group, would have to unload the Parachute Battalion in the Tulagi area and then cross the channel to land tanks on Guadalcanal. The landing craft carried by the ships of the amphibious force amounted to 480 1942 model boats of various types, in addition to the vehicles of the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion of the 1st Marine Division. There were 8 30-foot landing craft, 308 36-foot landing craft personnel, large and landing craft personnel ramps, 116 36-foot landing craft, vehicle, and 48 45-foot landing craft, mechanized. The 30-foot boats and the landing craft personnel large were the old fixed bow type without ramps. The landing craft personnel ramps, the landing craft, mechanized and the landing craft, vehicle were equipped with movable bow ramps. The landing craft, vehicle, each with a 10,000-pound cargo capacity, could carry 75mm and 105mm howitzers or 1-ton trucks, but heavier equipment, 90mm and 5-inch guns and heavy trucks would have to be carried in the landing craft, mechanized. The landing craft personnel, large, could carry troops and portable supplies, but all supplies brought ashore by the landing craft personnel, large, would have to be lifted over the gunwales by hand at a considerable expense of time and manpower. The amphibian tractors, landing vehicles tracked, about to make their first appearance in action, were an early, unarmored type, mounting 2 machine guns. The final details of organization of the boat pool, including all boats from the ships of the amphibious force, were completed during the rehearsal. 10 boat groups, varying in size from 16 to 64 boats of various types, were organized. Nearly every group included 1 craft assigned as a repair boat. 4 groups, including 103 craft, were assigned to the Tulagi area to unload Transport Group Y, and the remaining 6 groups were assigned to unload Transport Group X at Guadalcanal. The attacking combat teams would be brought ashore by 91 craft, 63 carrying Combat Team No. 1 and headquarters and supporting troops of Combat Group A, and 28 carrying Combat Team No. 3. Combat Group A's tanks would be brought in by 16 landing craft, mechanized. 41 boats would carry the next wave's Combat Team No. 4 and headquarters, Combat Group B. Following the landing of the first elements of Combat Group B, the 41 boats would join an additional 51 to carry Combat Team No. 5. Combat Team No. 6 would be borne ashore by 57 craft. After the landing of the attack troops, the landing craft, mechanized of the boat groups, in general, were to continue unloading heavy equipment from certain specified ships, while the other boats returned to their mother ships to unload them, bringing in supporting troops and supplies on the second, third, and succeeding trips to shore. General Vandergrift also ordered that amphibian tractors be used wherever possible to haul supplies. Although not a tactical vehicle, the unarmored amphibian tractor could sail from ship to shore, surmount the beach, and carry supplies overland directly to regimental and battalion dumps, with a resulting economy in both time and labour. Those troop commanders who were to be responsible for the complete unloading of the ships were to assign enough men to work all ships' holds 24 hours per day, for all ships were to be unloaded in the shortest possible time. Supplies were to move over the beaches in accordance with the following priority: ammunition, water, combat transport, rations, medical supplies, gasoline, other transport, and lastly, miscellaneous supplies. All men, as originally planned, were to wear green utility suits and to carry head nets and cot nets for protection against mosquitoes. Each man was to carry 2 canteens of water if enough canteens were available. The men of the task and landing forces were to initiate the first Allied offensive in the Pacific, one of the largest amphibious operations in the history of the United States up to that time. The tactical plans were hastily prepared, but they had a broad and well-established base in the doctrines governing landings on hostile shores, which had been developed during the years preceding the outbreak of war. It is significant to note that whereas plans for the landing operations proper were detailed and comprehensive, there was no reference to systematic resupply of the 1st Marine Division, which carried sufficient supplies for 60 days. Although on 14 July Admiral Gormley had directed the 7th Marines in Samoa to be ready to embark on 4 days' notice with 90 days' supply and 10 units of fire, no Army units for reinforcing or relieving the division were alerted. While the invasion force was assembling and rehearsing, Army B-17s of the 26th Squadron of the 11th Bombardment Group, which were part of Task Force 63, had been executing daily bombardments of Guadalcanal and Tulagi to soften them before the invasion. The 26th Squadron was then based at Efate and Espiritu Santo. The airstrips at both islands were each 5,000 feet long and 150 feet wide by the end of July, but facilities were primitive. The runways were soft and were frequently covered by water from the many rains. For night takeoffs, the ends of the runways were marked by truck headlights, and the sides by rags stuck in bottles of gasoline and set ablaze. Beginning on 31 July, the B-17s bombed Guadalcanal and Tulagi for 7 days. 1 B-17 was lost, but the 26th Squadron shot down 3 Japanese fighters. Since the airfield on Guadalcanal had no planes, the principal targets were the runways and suspected supply depots and anti-aircraft positions on both Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The amphibious force, covered by the Air Support Force and by Task Force 63, had left Coro in the Fijis on a southwesterly course on 31 July. 4 days later, the Betelgeuse and Xylin with their escorts joined Transport Groups X and Y, respectively, to bring the total number of ships in the expeditionary force to 82. And the number of men in the landing force to over 19,000. Sailing in 3 great concentric circles, the transports in the middle, the cruisers around them, and the screening destroyers in the outer circle, the amphibious force reached a point south of Rennell, then swung north and set its course for Savo Island, while the carriers sailed for a point southwest of Guadalcanal. On 5 and 6 August, during the amphibious force's northward run west of Guadalcanal, overcast skies and a heavy haze reduced visibility to 4 miles and limited air operations. Intermittent rain squalls helped to cover the ships, which were maintaining radio silence. There were no contacts with the enemy. The weather cleared for the approaching American ships on the night of 6–7 August, and the amphibious force, still undetected, raised Savo Island at 2 o'clock. Clear skies and a moon in the last quarter provided good visibility as the force passed into the calm, narrow waters between Savo, Guadalcanal, and Florida. The transport groups separated at 2:40 a.m., 7 August. The 4 transports and 4 destroyer transports of one group sailed around Savo to enter Sealark Channel between Savo and Florida. The 15 transports of the Guadalcanal group entered the channel between Savo and Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal. As daylight broke, the islands lay quiet. The Japanese were taken by surprise. Not one shot had been fired at the amphibious force. The supporting warships took station, while their observation planes flew over the target areas. The 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers of the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group opened fire on their targets between Kukum and Coley Point on Guadalcanal at 6:14 a.m. 2 minutes later, the cruiser and 2 destroyers comprising the Tulagi Fire Support Group opened fire on Tulagi. The minesweepers covered their assigned areas but found no mines. By 6:51, the transport groups had reached their areas, 9,000 yards off the landing beaches, and lowered landing craft into the water. A calm sea permitted the troops to descend via cargo net gangways on both sides of all transports into the landing craft. H-hour, the time for the Tulagi landing, was set for 8 o'clock. 0 hour, the time for the landing on Guadalcanal, was finally set at 9:10 a.m. Ships' gunfire and strafing by fighter planes quickly sank a small gasoline schooner, the only visible enemy vessel in Sealark Channel. Dive bombers and fighters from the carriers, then maneuvering 75 miles to the south in open waters, bombed and strafed the target areas, but encountered only feeble anti-aircraft fire. 44 planes struck at Guadalcanal, and 41 attacked Tulagi. 18 Japanese seaplanes were destroyed. The initial Allied landing in the Solomon Islands, which preceded those on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, was made by a covering force. Supported by fire from the cruiser and destroyers of the Tulagi Fire Support Group and the minesweepers, landing boats put B Company of the 2nd Marines ashore near Haleta, a village adjoining a promontory on Florida Island which commands Beach Blue on Tulagi. The remainder of the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Marines landed at Halavo on Florida to cover the landings. No enemy forces opposed either landing, and the battalion was later withdrawn. Covered by fire from the supporting cruiser and destroyers, the first wave of landing craft carrying B and D companies of the 1st Raider Battalion sailed to Beach Blue on Tulagi, a small, hilly island about 3 miles long. The enemy was not defending Beach Blue, but had retired to caves and dugouts in the hills and ravines on the southeast part of the island. The only casualty in landing was 1 raider dead by rifle fire. The second wave, A and C companies, quickly followed B and D companies, which then advanced north across the island. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, then came ashore and pushed northwest to clear out the enemy in the northwest part of the island. The raider companies turned right and advanced to the southeast, supported by E Company, the Raiders' Heavy Weapons Company. There was no hard fighting until the afternoon, when fire from Japanese caves and dugouts halted the raiders about 1 mile short of Tulagi's southeast tip. The Marines discovered that the ship's gunfire and dive bombing had not destroyed the caves and dugouts, most of which would withstand everything but a direct hit. Machine gun fire was relatively ineffective against the tunnels and caves, which were not constructed along straight lines. The most efficient means for destroying the enemy positions were grenades and high explosive charges placed by hand. The Japanese sailors and labourers fought from foxholes, pillboxes, slit trenches, and caves. They refused to surrender and fought until they were shot or blown up. Machine gunners fired their weapons until they were dead. When one gunner fell, another would take his place, a process that continued until all in the position were dead. By late afternoon, it had become obvious that the raiders could not complete the capture of Tulagi on 7 August, and the battalion established a defensive line about 1,000 yards from the southeast tip of the island. The 5 raider companies and G Company of the 5th Marines occupied these positions, which the enemy attacked repeatedly but unsuccessfully throughout the night of 7–8 August. The first reports estimated that the raiders had suffered casualties amounting to 22% of their total strength on Tulagi. The 1st Parachute Battalion was reported to have lost from 50 to 60% on Gavutu. General Vandergrift requested Admiral Turner at 1:35 a.m., 8 August, to release the remaining battalions of the 2nd Marines from Division Reserve for the Tulagi-Gavutu operation. Admiral Turner assented. On the morning of 8 August, F and E companies of the 5th Marines, having cleared the northwest part of Tulagi, joined G Company and the 5 companies of the 1st Raider Battalion. The combined force pressed its attack, reduced the enemy positions, and by 1500 hours had completed the occupation of Tulagi. Only 3 of the original Japanese garrisons surrendered. An estimated 40 escaped to Florida by swimming. The remainder, about 200 men, were annihilated. The Marine casualties on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, which had been exaggerated in the first reports, were lighter than those of the Japanese. On Tulagi, 36 were annihilated and 54 wounded. Captured materiel included trucks, motorcycles, ammunition, gasoline, radio supplies, 2 13mm anti-aircraft guns, 1 3-inch gun, and 10 machine guns. While the 1st Raider Battalion and the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines were reducing Tulagi, the islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo, lying 3,000 yards to the east, also saw hard fighting. Gavutu is 250 by 500 yards in size, and Tanambogo, a slightly smaller island, is joined to Gavutu by a 300-yard-long concrete causeway. Dive bombers, SBDs, attacked Gavutu from 11:45 to 11:55 on 7 August. The Tulagi Fire Support Group shelled Gavutu from 11:55 to 12 o'clock to cover the 7-mile approach of the 13 landing craft bearing the 1st Parachute Battalion to the seaplane slips and jetties on Gavutu's northeast corner. The bombardment had knocked several large concrete blocks from the ramps into the water, and the parachutists were forced to land at the docks and mount them in face of enemy small arms fire. The first wave reached shore safely, but succeeding waves were hit hard, about 1 man in 10 becoming a casualty. By 1400 hours, the parachutists were advancing inland under fire from the Japanese emplaced on the island's single hill and on nearby Tanambogo. By 1800 hours, the battalion had secured the hill and raised the national colours there. The Japanese retained possession of several dugouts until the afternoon of 8 August, when they were reduced by the parachutists and 2 companies of the 2nd Marines. In spite of air bombardment and naval shelling, the Japanese on Tanambogo continued active on 7 August. After being withdrawn from Haleta, B Company of the 2nd Marines attempted to land on Tanambogo's north coast after a 5-minute naval bombardment, but the attack failed. About 11:30 the next day, the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Marines and 2 light tanks attacked Tanambogo from the beach and the causeway and secured most of the island by late afternoon. By nightfall, all the Japanese were dead. Marine casualties in the Tanambogo-Gavutu attacks had been relatively heavy. 108 were dead or missing, 140 wounded. The Marines later estimated that nearly 1,000 Japanese had held Gavutu and Tanambogo, but the actual figure was about 500. On 8 and 9 August, the 2nd Marines completed the northern attack by seizing the adjacent islets of Mbangai, Makambo, and Kokumtambu. Beach Red, which lies about 6,000 yards east of Lunga Point, between the Tenaru and Tenavatu rivers, had been selected for the Guadalcanal landings. The transports of Group X initially anchored 9,000 yards off Beach Red on the morning of 7 August. The destroyers of the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group took their stations 5,000 yards north of the beach at 8:40 a.m. to mark the line of departure for the landing craft. The assigned liaison planes made 8 runs at low altitudes to mark the extremities of the beaches with smoke. The 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers of the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group began firing at 9 o'clock to cover a 3,200-yard-long area from a point extending 800 yards on either side of Beach Red to a depth of 200 yards. The first wave of landing craft, carrying troops of the reinforced 5th Marines, less the 2nd Battalion, crossed the line of departure 5,000 yards off Beach Red. As the landing craft drew to within 1,300 yards of the beach, the warships ceased firing. There were no Japanese on the beach. The Marines went ashore at 9:10 on a 1,600-yard front, the reinforced 1st Battalion on the right, the reinforced 3rd Battalion on the left. Regimental headquarters followed at 9:38, and by 9:40 heavy weapons troops had come ashore to act as regimental reserve. All boat formations had crossed the line of departure promptly and in good order, and had reached their assigned beach areas. The attack battalions of the 5th Marines then advanced inland about 600 yards to establish a beachhead perimeter bounded on the west by the Tenaru River, on the east by the Tenavatu River, or on the south by an east-west branch of the Tenaru, and to cover the landings of successive units. Landing of the reinforced 1st Marines in column of battalions had begun at 9:30. The 2nd Battalion led, followed by the 3rd and 1st Battalions. By 11 o'clock the entire reinforced regiment had come ashore. Meanwhile, in the absence of enemy mines and shore defences, the transports had moved 7,000 yards closer to the shore. To provide direct support, the 75mm pack howitzers of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 11th Marines came ashore with the attack battalions of the 5th and 1st Marines. The 105mm howitzers of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, had been assigned to general support, but were not ready for action until the afternoon. The howitzers were landed separately from their prime movers, which had been held on board ship because there were not enough ramp boats to bring them ashore promptly. When the 105s reached shore, there were no prime movers immediately available to pull them up the beach. Whenever amphibian tractors were available at the beach, they were used to pull the 105s until the prime movers, 1-ton trucks, instead of the authorized 2.5-ton 6-wheel drive trucks, came ashore in the afternoon. The artillery battalions reverted to control of headquarters, 11th Marines, when that headquarters landed. All battalions upon landing registered their fire by air observation. When the attacking regiments and their supporting pack howitzers were ashore, the advance toward the airfield was ready to begin. The 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines was to advance west along the beach toward the Lunga River, while the 1st Marines attacked southwest toward Mount Austin. The 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines, the artillery, engineer, pioneer, and special weapons and defense battalions were to hold the beach during the advance. At 11:15, the 1st Marines passed through the 5th Marines' lines. Engineers put a temporary bridge upstream on the Tenaru, using amphibian tractors as pontoons. The 1st Marines crossed the river and turned southwest toward Mount Austin. On the beach, the 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines crossed the mouth of the Tenaru at 13:30 and marched toward the Ilu. Neither regiment met any Japanese. The 1st Marines, advancing inland with battalions echeloned to the left and rear, progressed slowly. The only map which the regiment had to guide it was vague. The angle of declination between grid and true north was not shown. The regimental historian stated later that, had commanders been able to study aerial photographs before the landing, they might have picked easy, natural routes instead of a straight compass course through the jungle. The troops were heavily loaded with ammunition, packs, mortars, and heavy machine guns as they struggled through the thick, fetid jungle. The humid heat exhausted the men, whose strength had already been sapped by weeks aboard crowded transports. Salt tablets were insufficient in number. Troops in the Solomons needed 2 canteens of water per day per man, but the number of canteens available had permitted the issue of but 1 to each man. All these factors served to slow the advance of both regiments. By dusk, the regiments had each advanced about 1 mile. General Vandergrift, who had come ashore at 16:01, ordered them to halt in order to reorient and establish contact. The 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines established a perimeter defense at the mouth of the Ilu River, while the 3 battalions of the 1st Marines dug in for the night in the jungle about 3,500 yards to the south. Considering the division's state of training and the inexperience of the junior officers and non-commissioned officers, tactical operations were satisfactory, but General Vandergrift criticized the uniform and lamentable failure of all units to patrol their fronts and flanks properly. Organization for landing and the ship-to-shore movement of troops had been very good. As the Japanese were not opposing the advance, the operation did not involve a thorough test of methods of controlling ships' gunfire by shore-based fire control parties, but nothing had indicated the need for fundamental changes in doctrine. Coordination between ground forces, on the one hand, and naval and air units on the other, had been unsatisfactory, for the naval forces were not using the same map as the 1st Marine Division. In view of the relatively few air support missions requested by the ground troops, the centralized control of supporting aircraft had been satisfactory. Had the division met heavy resistance on Guadalcanal, a more direct means of air-to-ground communication would probably have been necessary. The problem had been recognized in advance, but there had not been time to organize and train air control groups for liaison duty with regiments and battalions. The liaison planes furnished little information to division headquarters, for the pilots were not able to observe very much in the jungle, and some of the messages they transmitted were vague. At 2000 hours, when 10,000 troops had come ashore, General Vandergrift ordered the 1st Marines to attack toward the Lunga the next morning, instead of taking Mount Austin. He recognized that Mount Austin commanded Lunga Point, but because it was too large and too far away for his relatively small force to hold, he decided not to take it immediately. Supported by tanks, the 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines crossed the Ilu at 9:30 a.m. on 8 August. Progress was slow at first as the battalion advanced on a wide front. General Vandergrift, then convinced that his division was not faced by a sizable organized force on Guadalcanal, ordered the battalion to contract its front, cross the Lunga River, and seize Kukum village before nightfall. By 1500 hours, the advance guard had travelled almost 6,000 yards to overrun a small party of Japanese firing rifles and machine guns from knolls on the outskirts of Kukum. Kukum, containing one 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, one 1-inch anti-aircraft gun, two 37mm anti-tank guns, and heavy machine guns, was otherwise undefended. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines had covered 4,500 yards to capture the airfield by 1600 hours. The enemy garrison, composed of 430 sailors and 1,700 labourers, had fled westward without attempting to defend or destroy their installations, including the nearly completed runway. General Vandergrift wrote, "The extent to which the enemy had been able to develop their Lunga Point positions was remarkable in view of the short time of occupation. Since 4 July they had succeeded in constructing large semi-permanent camps, finger wharves, bridges, machine shops, 2 large radio stations, ice plants, 2 large and permanent electric power plants, an elaborate air compressor plant for torpedoes, and a nearly completed aerodrome with hangars, blast pens, and a runway. Besides the runway and the weapons in Kukum, the Japanese had abandoned a store of .25 caliber rifles, .25, and .303 caliber machine guns, 270mm and 275mm guns, ammunition, gasoline, oil, individual equipment, machinery, Ford and Chevrolet-type trucks, and 2 radars. They left stocks of rice, tea, hardtack, dried kelp, noodles, canned goods, and large quantities of beer and sake behind. The Marines took over the abandoned weapons and used them to bolster their defences. The 100-pound bags of rice and other food in the commissary dumps were added to the Marines' limited stores. The Japanese left among their personal belongings many diaries, which were valuable sources of information for Allied intelligence. About 35 of the Japanese trucks were serviceable. Lighter than American military transport, they proved less efficient. Without powered front axles, they stuck easily, but were a valuable addition to the 1st Marine Division's limited motor transport, and were used as long as they held together. The division engineers also used the Japanese rollers, mixers, surveying equipment, gasoline locomotives, and hopper cars in the subsequent completion of the airfield. Tactical operations had proceeded favourably. The Guadalcanal forces had landed unopposed and captured the airfield without casualties. In the Tulagi, Gavutu-Tanambogo area, all objectives had been taken at the cost of 144 annihilated and 194 wounded, while the defending garrisons had been destroyed. By 9 August, 10,900 troops had landed on Guadalcanal and 6,075 on Tulagi. To support the infantry, 3 field artillery battalions, with 3 units of fire, plus special weapons, tanks, tank destroyers, and part of the 3rd Defence Battalion, had landed on Guadalcanal, while the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines with 75mm pack howitzers, and part of the 3rd Defence Battalion had landed on Tulagi. Logistical operations, in contrast with tactical developments, had seriously bogged down. The 1st Pioneer Battalion had been charged with the duty of unloading supplies from the landing craft as they touched at Beach Red, while a Navy beachmaster and shore party directed the boat movements at the beach. Of the 596 men, including naval medical personnel of the Pioneer Battalion, 1 platoon of 52 went to Tulagi, with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, and another remained on board one of the cargo ships. About 490 men on Beach Red were to handle supplies for the Guadalcanal force of the 1st Marine Division. By 10:43 of 7 August, the beachmaster's party was operating on Beach Red. Unloading the landing boats proved to be an exhausting and almost impossible job, for so many of them lacked movable bow ramps which could be let down to speed the removal of supplies from the boats. The pioneers had to lift the supplies up and over the gunwales to unload them. On the other hand, the unarmored amphibian tractors demonstrated a usefulness exceeding all expectations. Used as an ambulance, a prime mover, and an ammunition carrier, the amphibian tractor, later to play such an important tactical role in the Pacific, was able to move directly from ship's side to inland dump, easily traversing the sea, reefs, beaches, and swamps without halting. But there were only a few amphibian tractors. Too few troops had been provided to unload boats and move materiel off the beach. While loaded landing craft hovered off Beach Red, which was already cluttered with unsorted gear, hundreds of Marines who were waiting to move forward were in the vicinity, but did not assist on the beach. General Vandergrift later stated that the unloading party had been too small. He pointed out that he had anticipated that his division would have to fight a major engagement before capturing the airfield, and he had therefore expected to use most of his troops tactically. At that time, too, the 2nd Marines Less 1 Battalion had not been released by Admiral Turner. When supplies began to pile up on the beach, sailors from the transports joined the shore party to try to get the boats unloaded and the supplies moved farther inland. Pioneers and sailors worked to the point of exhaustion. The extreme heat caused many to suffer from nausea and severe headaches, but the beach remained cluttered. Enemy air attacks also delayed unloading operations. 25 twin-engine Japanese bombers from Rabaul attacked the ships in the early afternoon of 7 August. Several planes were shot down by the covering fighters and gunfire from the transports and screening warships. The Bougainville Coast Watcher had warned the Allied ships in time so that none were hit, but the transports had been obliged to cease unloading and get underway. About 1 hour later, a second wave of Japanese bombers drove the transports off again and damaged the destroyer Mugford. The Japanese aircraft fortunately did not attack the gear which crowded the beach, but 3 hours of unloading time had been lost. By nightfall on 7 August, 100 landing craft were beached, waiting to be unloaded, while an additional 50, unable to find landing room on the beach, stood offshore. Unloading was continued into the night, but the tired shore party could not cope with its task, and operations broke down completely. At 23:30, the shore party commander, stating that unloading was entirely out of hand, requested that the ships cease discharging cargo until 8 August, when he estimated the beach would be cleared. Admiral Turner and General Vandergrift assented. To provide more room for incoming supplies, General Vandergrift doubled the length of the beach by extending Beach Red's boundary west to the Block 4 River on 8 August. But the situation did not improve. 40 more enemy bombers flew over Florida about noon to disperse the ships again, this time setting the George F. Elliott afire and damaging the destroyer Jarvis. The Elliott burned until she was a total loss. The Jarvis left for Noumea but was never heard from again. A false air alarm later in the afternoon forced the ships to get underway once more. The Japanese garrisons on Guadalcanal and in the Tulagi area had not been able to resist the American attack effectively, although an enemy report claimed that 10 transports and the greater part of the escorting naval forces had been destroyed. The air attacks on 7-8 August had not seriously damaged the amphibious force, but they had caused serious delays in unloading. These were only preliminaries, however, to the heavy blow the Japanese were preparing to deliver. 5 heavy and 2 light cruisers and 1 destroyer assembled in St. George's Channel off Rabaul on the morning of 8 August, with orders to attack the American transports in Sea Lark Channel. This force sailed south along the east coast of Bougainville until sighted by an Allied patrol plane from the southwest Pacific area, which radioed a warning to Melbourne. The Japanese ships then reversed their course for a time, but after the plane departed, turned west through Bougainville Strait and then south through the narrow waters, the slot between the 2 chains of the Solomons. At 1800 hours on 8 August, Admiral Turner received word that the Japanese force was approaching. The screening force, augmented by the fire support warships, was then covering the northern approaches to Sea Lark Channel. 2 destroyers, the Ralph Talbot and the Blue, were posted northwest of Savo Island on either side of the channel to maintain watch by radar. 3 cruisers, the Australia, Canberra and Chicago, and the destroyers Bagley and Patterson were patrolling the waters between Savo and Cape Esperance. The cruisers Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, and the destroyers Helm and Wilson patrolled between Savo and Florida. 2 cruisers, screened by destroyers, covered the transports. Aircraft from the American carrier force southwest of Guadalcanal had been supporting the amphibious force during daylight hours, but this protection was about to be withdrawn. 2 days of enemy air action and operational losses had reduced fighter strength from 99 to 78 planes. Fuel was running low. Admiral Fletcher, commanding Task Force 61, was worried by the numbers of enemy bombers operating in the area. At 18:07, 8 August, he asked Admiral Gormley for permission to withdraw his carriers. Admiral Gormley consented. The force would be withdrawn, he announced, until enough land-based aircraft to protect the line of communications to Guadalcanal could be assembled, and until sufficient stocks of aviation fuel could be maintained at Guadalcanal to support fighter and bomber operations. The carrier forces retired southward early the next morning. When informed that the carrier forces were to be withdrawn, Admiral Turner called General Vandergrift and Admiral Crutchley aboard the flagship Macaulay. General Vandergrift left his command post at the mouth of the Ilu River to board the Macaulay about 23:25, 8 August. Admiral Crutchley took the flagship Australia out of the screening force and sailed aboard her to the Macaulay to attend the conference. Turner informed them that the imminent retirement of the carriers would leave the amphibious force without effective air protection, and that he had decided to withdraw the ships of the amphibious force at 6 o'clock the next morning. General Vandergrift was seriously disturbed by this news. The retirement of the ships, he felt, would place his division in a most alarming position. Unloading of supplies at Tulagi had not even started at 7 August because the Japanese had held so much of the island. The 1st Marine Division's plans were based on the assumption that the transports would remain offshore until 11 August, and by the night of 8-9 August, more than half the supplies embarked by the division still remained in the ships' holds. Meanwhile, the Japanese cruisers and destroyers, which had earlier been discovered, had now approached Savo Island undetected. Shortly before reaching Savo, the cruisers catapulted seaplanes, which flew over Sealark Channel to search for the American and Australian ships. About midnight of 8 August, the Allied ships in the Channel reported that unidentified aircraft were overhead. About 1:45, August 9, a seaplane from the Japanese cruiser Chokai dropped flares over the transports, while the Japanese warships slipped unobserved past the Ralph Talbot and the Blue. After passing the destroyers, the Japanese sighted the Allied ships between Savo and Cape Esperance. Still undetected, they fired torpedoes which struck the Chicago and the Canberra. After this attack, the Japanese left to strike the American ships between Savo and Florida. They illuminated their targets briefly with searchlights, then put heavy fire into the American cruisers. Unwilling to risk further action with the Allied cruisers, and fearful that American aircraft might attack his ships at daylight, the Japanese commander then led his force northward away from Savo. On the morning of 9 August, the Japanese force reached Rabaul. The next day, off New Ireland, the cruiser Kako was sunk by torpedoes from an American submarine. The Battle of Savo Island was one of the worst defeats ever suffered by ships of the United States Navy. The enemy had taken them by surprise and defeated in detail the 2 forces on either side of Savo. The only enemy ship damaged was the Chokai, whose operations room was destroyed. The Vincennes and Quincy sank within 1 hour after being attacked. The badly hit Canberra burned all night and was torpedoed by American destroyers the next morning to sink her prior to the departure of the amphibious force. The severely battered cruiser Astoria sank about midday on 9 August. The Chicago and the Ralph Talbot had both been damaged. Fortunately, the Japanese commander had lacked sufficient daring to execute his orders to attack the weakly defended transports in Sealark Channel. Had he done so, he could have effectively halted Allied operations in the South Pacific and completely cut off the 1st Marine Division from reinforcement and supply, for all the transports and cargo ships of the South Pacific Force were present in Sealark Channel. The damage which the Japanese inflicted upon the warships delayed the departure of Admiral Turner's ships, which remained in Sealark Channel until the afternoon of 9 August. But at 1500 hours, 10 transports, 1 cruiser, 4 destroyers, and the minesweepers sailed toward Noumea, followed at 1830 by the remaining ships. Admiral Turner accompanied the latter force. Of the original Marine landing force of over 19,000 men, nearly all were ashore before the departure of the ships, but a few detachments of the 1st Marine Division remained on board. Most of the men of the 2nd Marines, reinforced, had landed, but 1,390 men of the regiment, including regimental headquarters, companies from the 2nd Amphibian Tractor and 2nd Service Battalions, and part of the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, comprising 75mm pack howitzers, were subsequently landed at Espiritu Santo by the retiring amphibious force. Almost 17,000 Marines and naval personnel had landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Supplies for these men were limited. Of the 60 days' supplies and 10 units of fire with which the division had embarked, less than half had been unloaded. There were about 4 units of fire available on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Guadalcanal had 6 million rounds of .30 caliber ammunition and 890mm shells. Food stocks were low. When an inventory was completed about 15 August, it was found that food for only 30 days was on Han B rations for 17 days, C rations for 3 days, and Japanese rations for 10 days. Troop rations were reduced to 2 daily meals. None of the 3rd Defence Battalion's 5-inch coast defence guns, nor any long-range warning or fire control radar sets had been landed. Only 18 spools of barbed wire had been brought ashore. Heavy construction equipment was still in the ship's holds. Since the liaison planes assigned to the division had been destroyed on board their cruisers in the Battle of Savo Island, air reconnaissance of Guadalcanal would not be possible. The departure of the air support and amphibious forces left the 1st Marine Division alone in the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area exposed to Japanese attacks, without air cover or naval surface support. The nearest Allied outpost was the primitive base at Espiritu Santo. The enemy posts at Buca and the Shortlands were only 363 and 285 nautical miles away, respectively, and Rabaul itself lay only 565 nautical miles to the northwest. The 1st Marine Division was virtually a besieged garrison.